The Honourable Lawrence Llamas.
Mr. Speaker, it is with great honour that I rise to deliver my fourth budget address. In all likelihood, the final one I shall deliver to this Parliament for the foreseeable future. It has been a tremendous privilege to serve this community over the past 4 years. Being able to serve our people in one of Gibraltar's critical junctures has not just been a major learning curve, but more importantly, a duty I have executed with pride. I hope people whom I have met through the trajectory of my term in public life have felt that I have represented them well. I certainly have given it my best shot. Before addressing the areas of my responsibilities, I shall touch upon some of the initiatives I have led throughout the past year since my last budget address. To this day, the issues which I have raised are still affecting our community. Mr. Speaker, I would like to start my address with what I feel is the most important area within my shadow responsibilities, that is mental health, an area which should continuously remain at the top of the political agenda. In an appropriation of almost £130 million towards our health budget, only a very small percentage will in actual fact reach the mental health services, 6% in 2017 by the Minister's own admission. Mr. Speaker, I say so once more. According to the Honourable Minister for Health, just 6% of the budget reaches mental health services. As a result, there is still a long way to go before mental health is treated equally to that of physical health. I welcome the recent announcement from the Minister for Health regarding the new liaison nurse based at Ocean Views as an improvement to the existing service. However, I strongly believe that this is simply not enough and more radical policies have to be implemented. I have publicly stated what the GST position is regarding mental health. Firstly, the need to care for persons within the community as much as possible by expanding the domiciliary care into mental health services and starting a household care services too. Secondly, we believe there is a need to create supported internships for persons living with mental health illness. I would like to take this opportunity to recognise the good work done by the charity Positive Pathways in this area, but far more needs to be done, and I shall talk about supported employment later in my address. Thirdly, the GST's published policy is that there is a need for a crisis and management team to deal with instances of crises, but also follow-up care and management services. Last October, I undertook the Healthy Minds Matter survey. The point of this was to try and understand what the drivers affecting mental health well-being are, together with what the issues that affect service users living with mental health illnesses are too. I was pleased it did in fact serve its purpose. One of the main points revealed in the survey was how easily people who are living with mental health issues can give up on seeking appropriate care if the appropriate care service is not there to embrace them. Mr. Speaker, accessibility is key. Additionally, for those persons already in the system, there are instances in breaks of continuity of care and an apparent lack of aftercare which dramatically undermines the chances of long-lasting recovery. During the summer of last year, there was a major crisis in the mental health services with a rapid turnover of psychiatrists, or rather, the lack of active psychiatrists in our community. The crisis was eventually overcome, psychiatrists were brought in. However, I am still to this very day receiving concerns from service users as to the turnover of psychiatrists and how their care and relationship with the professional is effectively reset to zero every time a contract is not renewed or a psychiatrist decides to leave because of the instability of the post. Therefore, the government's recent announcement for a liaison nurse has been assigned the responsibility of essentially fronting the service is not enough. We must do more to ensure that there is not only that we retain the best professionals in the service, but that we increase the investment in resources and not just in the buildings. We must do more to ensure that there is a liaison team who can properly manage and care in and outside of the community. Service users build a relationship over time with consultants and professionals, and it is safe to say that it is simply not right to have to explain what their health issues are every time there is a new consultant. Mr. Speaker, during the last year, I have tried to understand the low morale and absenteeism in the GHA. Last year, I carried out a survey on morale and the results coincide with everything that is being said by our unions and workers, not just in our health sector, but in law enforcement agencies and civil service departments too. Workers feel neglected and often not consulted. Workers claim to be undervalued and under-resourced. There are also allegations of bullying and intimidation, which often don't get reported, or if they do, not rigorously investigated. Greater consultation and communication with employees in the sector is required. This must be conducted in a safe and secure manner that does not expose employees to any negative detriment. At the same time, absenteeism is of huge concern. I have tried to understand through questions in this House the extent of the absenteeism in our public health sector, together with the reasons for the absenteeism too. Unfortunately, I have not been able to study any statistics in relation to this because the government don't adequately harvest any data. However, absenteeism is a costly affair, with relief cover running into the millions of pounds and substitution allowances being paid left, right and centre. This is a serious matter that must be tackled. The government have not given this the priority it deserves. In the Principal Auditor's report from 1516, the Principal Auditor highlights the mismanagement and lack of control in the GHA with regard to sick and annual leave records. This goes to the very heart of why we need e-services, not just for service users, but for the government as an employer too. The Principal Auditor has also given examples of leave records not being updated for over 7 months in some cases. He has also highlighted approximately 24% of records examined as inaccurate. This is worth investigating in and managing. We have the technological advances at our fingertips to turn this around, but instead we're not doing anything about it. Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Honourable Minister for Health, Care and Justice, Mr. Costa. He has opened the doors to the Ministry and made available senior officials to discuss particular cases and issues. I applaud his non-partisan approach when dealing with matters brought to his attention. With a proposed budget for this financial year of 128 million, questions about the GHA's efficiency and value for money need to be made, and I do trust that the Minister is very thoroughly looking into it. It certainly can be said that our GHA is not limited when it comes to funding, and long may it continue, Mr. Speaker. But there are systematic problems in our health service, which means the investment does not trickle down to the relevant services. The GHA is to be commended for the number of surgical and non-surgical procedures it undertakes. The Minister should be rightly proud of his legacy in this area, which he has fought hard to achieve. However, the breakdown in communication systems internally and with patients is a gap that needs to be addressed. The proper filing of records and ability to locate files promptly are critical matters which must be addressed too. Additionally, the need to repatriate services has never been more essential than it is now, with the backdrop of Brexit and the challenges this may bring. Whilst I appreciate that the government has been focused on this issue, evidenced by the record-breaking 19.4 million spent on sponsored patients in 16-17 to 11.4 million spent in the last financial year. However, the increase in this year's forecast to 40 million sends mixed signals as to the intention of the government moving forward. Mr. Speaker, I have publicly asked the government to provide details in relation to contracts entered into with health providers. It may be standard in commercial contracts that parts of it may be commercially sensitive, such as itemised value of specific services. However, there can be certain information which can be made public. I therefore repeat my plea to the government to respond on what I feel are reasonable and legitimate questions, that is, the overall value of the contract, whether fees are payable per patient or a flat monthly fee, or a combination of both, the commencement and expectation during the contracts, the number of patients currently receiving care at these tertiary centres, and the expected number of patients expected in the future under these agreements, and finally, what aftercare patient support procedures are in place. I would be grateful for clarification as to why the increase in the forecast for the current financial year to 40 million with regards to sponsored patients. Despite the huge budget in our health system, we are still dependent on tertiary centres for standard cardiac and neurology care. This surely must become a priority for our short-term future. I call on the Minister to seriously consider employing full-time specialists in these areas locally. We welcome the Minister's achievement in securing access to pharmaceuticals at the best prices via the NHS drugs framework in 2 years' time, and the exceptional interim procedure for pharmaceuticals via NHS Trust. This will no doubt reflect in a positive cost reduction for the taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, I would also like clarification regarding the rental contracts entered into with the new primary care centre and the new paediatric centre. We know the rental costs will exceed at least 1.3 million per year, but how much has the actual extension of buildings cost? What has happened to the new building for the new ambulance and the new MRI supposedly catered for in last year's estimates, alongside the new primary care centre and paediatric centre? And finally, what would happen if government-owned companies better located become available and the future government wish to consider moving the facilities of the primary care centre and paediatric to a government-owned property rather? What are the arrangements regarding the buildings built on rented land paid by the taxpayer? Now, moving to the primary care centre appointment system, I must say that the system finally seems to be working better, and the investment of £75,000 is certainly money well spent. I commend the Minister and his team in this regard. The feedback I receive is generally positive. However, there is need for an online system that cuts back the time to book appointments with specific doctors. There is also a need to prioritise appointments with specific doctors for persons with disabilities and persons with recurring illnesses. I hugely welcome the forthcoming changes for persons up to the age of 18 with disabilities when services are transitioned to the new buildings. However, additional needs has no age, and a bespoke service should be extended to all those who require greater support regardless of age. Since I first entered this House, I have been calling for greater measures for carers. It gave me great pleasure to hear the Minister recognise the silent champions in our economy that carers are. We must commit as a House to recognise carers beyond thanking them, but to look into proper policies which take into account training, respite, additional support and a carer's allowance. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to another area of my responsibility, the elderly. It is no secret that we have an ageing population. As such, we have a duty to ensure that we care for the most vulnerable in our society, but crucially, we must also ensure that we can protect the benefits that our elderly enjoy for future generations. Planning the future health and care services of an ageing population is a reality. Financial investment is crucial. We must develop a sustainable public policy which returns a dignified and high level of care for generations to come, whether persons are affected by low mobility or are living with dementia. Mr. Speaker, we in the GSD strongly believe there is a need to create a sustainable elderly care plan, where funds are ring-fenced to ensure appropriate health and care services for the future. If elected, the GSD is committed to this. That is to say, Mr. Speaker, the workforce of today prepare to finance their own care of tomorrow. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, the government should be promoting and facilitating community building initiatives, especially those done to support the most vulnerable in our society. As an example, it is unacceptable that the GADS, the Gibraltar Alzheimer's and Dementia Society, were given notice by the Housing Department to vacate Bishop Canilla House via letter with no consultation. We owe a debt of gratitude to the Society, who are continuously fundraising and channeling those funds into areas which enhance the service provided to service users. I therefore fail to understand how the common room at Bishop Canilla used by the Society was revoked. The Society hosted support group meetings and create fidget blankets amongst other things, which were designed to help those living with dementia and their carers. Mr. Speaker, I hope this can be resolved urgently and commend the good work done by GADS for the most vulnerable in our community. Moving on to elderly housing, the government recently announced that it would be building more specially built accommodation for the elderly. The GST started this as the creators of such life-changing policy for our elderly. We, of course, welcome the announcement. We welcome the announcement of today from the Minister to include elderly persons who live in private accommodation. However, we do differ in that we believe in means testing. As part of our means testing policy, the eligibility criteria to reside in one of the current or future elderly government rentals shall be extended to those who live in private accommodation. Mr. Speaker, this would allow elderly individuals who currently own a private accommodation to pay a substantial means-tested amount to rent or purchase into a government specially built accommodation. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, the Stay and Play programme during the summer proves extremely successful for the period it runs. However, we in the GST, for reasons already expressed publicly, believe that it should run to the Friday before school commences. But also, Mr. Speaker, that this sort of initiative should be extended to the elderly to keep the community engaged and motivated throughout the year. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the government have accepted the principle to reduce supply workers as much as possible. My concern is always one based on continuity of care, whilst appreciating the balancing act when bringing costs into account. Last year, when the government decided to pull Grand Home Care out of John Mactash Wing and award the future care contract to Medoc, it was welcoming to learn that the majority of employees were transferred from one provider to another. However, I shall be asking the government for an explanation at committee stage as to why the estimated appropriation for last year of 1.1 million has resulted in 1.8 million and is expected to grow a further to 2.3 million. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the youth. I must pay tribute to the dedicated youth workers in our community. They are truly vocational and make the most of the resources available to inspire a younger community. The investment in GAMPA is also to be welcomed. Together with the work done by the extraordinary professional team, this is now transcending into our schools and the positive effects are remarkable. Yet we must find ways to get children away from their screens, interacting and developing their skills. The long-lost Cinema Under the Stars was a fantastic community event. I urged the government last year to bring this back, whether at the Alameda Open Air Theatre or alternative venue. It makes sense from a family point of view, but also from a tourism point of view. Perhaps the Minister for Culture can enlighten me today with an announcement with this regard. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the regulation on sales with regards to energy drinks. Despite not having any inclination to do anything about this back in September 2017, I am glad the government had a change of heart. However, Mr. Speaker, it is important to be consistent in approach. If the government is serious about introducing measures to promote children's health, launch the Children Healthy and Active Multi-Agency Programme known as CHAMP, how can they defend approving the conversion of the former South District Post Office as a sweet shop next to a large school? Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the lack of threading policies through government actions are demonstrable. Indeed, the same can be said for the options available in public facilities around Gibraltar, in vending machines, in hospitals, not just for our children, but our adults too, drawing particular attention to the amount of fizzy drinks available at Ocean Views. Moving to another area of my responsibility, families. Later this week, I shall be publishing an opinion piece based on the proposed reform on parental leave, an attempt not to just equalise the gender pay gap, but also to narrow the gap between the private and public sector. Mr. Speaker, one thing I would like to bring to the attention of the House is the number of men who come to see me who fall out of the system following relationship breakdowns. We have a duty to support men who often lose out on quality time with their children and find themselves in unfortunate accommodation facilities. I believe women in need assist those men as and when they are able to do so, but at the end of the day, they function as a charity for women who have been subjected to domestic violence, not a shelter or hostel, and certainly not designed for men. I would like to pay tribute to the work done by Gennaro Attard, Michelle Pereira, and not least to Claire Borrell, who founded the charity and built it to what we see today. Whilst on the subject of families, Mr. Speaker, I would like to add my perspective on the sale of the 50% equity share on affordable housing of the 6 affordable housing estates: Waterport Terraces, Cumberland Terraces, Bayview Terraces, Nelson's View, Beachview Terraces and Mons Calpe Mews. If the government have raised 165 million, which is to be used to fund new affordable co-ownership projects, why is it that purchasers are being asked for substantive monthly payments beforehand, which would be equal or higher than their future mortgage payments? Why not means test those monthly payments instead? And whilst on the issue of affordable housing, Mr. Speaker, what is happening with our imaginative designs? The schools and the new Bob Belisa Mews look pretty much the same. Where is our diverse talent and vision in architecture? Mr. Speaker, I now turn to drug misuse, another extremely important area of my shadow responsibility. I must state my disappointment at the Chief Minister for not addressing this area within his budget address. It does not augur well from a perspective point of view. In a 4-hour speech, the Chief Minister said to either forget or conveniently forget to include a reference to the drugs issue is appalling, to say the least. Not one word on policies, on future, on how the government intends to tackle the problems we have ahead. Over the recent months, there has been considerable amount of public debate on drugs. Mr. Speaker, the GST has a track record and was a pioneer in the area of addiction and rehabilitation, in particular former GST Minister Hubert Corby and the Bruce's Farm Trust employees. It is lamentable that the project has not changed much in the past 8 years, other than by diminishing the number of beds offered. We have committed to providing alternative pathways to criminal route based on care, education and support to those individuals who are caught with Class A or B drugs that amount to personal use. Depending on the class and quantity of drugs, this is to include specifically designed education classes, compulsory attendance at support group meetings, community service and rehabilitation programs. The same will apply to those who test positive in A&E. Over the past 2 years, we have had more than 500 cases reporting at A&E. However, we in the GST believe that there should be a criminal fallback position to users who do not wish to engage in alternative pathways, and that drugs will remain illegal and criminal substances in law. This is our view, and this is what we wish to tackle when it comes to recreational drug users. In addition, we have also set out a wider policy on drugs. This includes providing a crisis care and management team to assist addicts in the community at times of need. Regarding rehabilitation, we believe that addicts should be rehabilitated from home as much as possible, and that the rehabilitation program should be diversified as much as possible. We would also look to provide a system of seamless transition from prehabilitation to rehabilitation to aftercare. Moreover, we would focus on employment for recovering addicts in form of supported internships and increasing aftercare services. Yes, Mr. Speaker, we need to put an end to the cliché war on drugs with a balanced, measured and sensible approach that would see law enforcement officers work with drug support workers. I also advocate for tougher sentences for importers and distributors of drugs. It is unfair for anyone to suggest that we lack vision, leadership or conviction when we have set our deeply consulted policy months ago. We have done our homework and reached out extensively, culminating in a published approach which is based on education, support and care, with the default position in law remaining illegal, where law enforcement officers will continue to be the first point of reference in order to assess the breach before taking the matter to the courts for large quantities or referring persons to drug support workers for personal use. Essentially, a new approach which would see law enforcement officers work with drug support workers in order to achieve the best results for the future. It is important not just as a politician, but as a parent to ensure we all understand, especially our youth, that serious actions have serious consequences, and to mitigate those consequences, it is going to require willpower and commitment. I welcome the announcement from the Minister for Justice with regards to the introduction of the new drug counselling services for persons in prison, together with mandatory drug testing programs in coming months. Mr. Speaker, turning to the medicinal cannabis and exportation project, our concerns in this area is that Gibraltar simply cannot harvest enough cannabis to sustain the local market, let alone export. We would therefore like clarification as to how this would actually work and whether there is an element of importation before packaging and exportation linked to the process, or how it is that the proposal is intended to work. With regards to the prescription of unlicensed medicinal products, the GST position remains that these decisions should lie with the clinicians and structured within a well-regulated system of medicinal products. As such, since the Drug Advisory Council in the UK recommended the parameters and framework moving forward, the GST immediately took heed and advocated for Gibraltar to follow suit based on the professional advice. The GST is of the opinion that products recommended by leading clinicians should be made available to alleviate the suffering of specific patients who are identified by doctors to fall within the category of persons who would benefit from such products via the GPMS prescription service. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to another area of my responsibility, that is supported employment. I often meet adults who are unable to obtain employment. This leads them to seek political solutions to their employment crisis. These individuals already feel socially marginalized due to mental health illness, disabilities, criminal history, and/or drug or alcohol addictions. Nevertheless, as a compassionate society, we should be empowering these persons with chances and opportunities. Give them the tools and a fair platform to improve their lives as individuals in an integrated manner. Instead, Mr. Speaker, all they get is a row of shut doors. It makes complete sense from a political perspective as well as from an employer's point of view as to why setting up a supported internship program in Gibraltar will work. A properly implemented policy will stimulate employment, get people into the right employment, and generally assist those who are struggling in this regard. The vision is not a complicated one to visualize. The Minister with responsibility for supported employment asked me during the last question and answer session for ideas which could improve this area. I am more than happy to share this with him. Firstly, we must offer employers and associated staff with a continuous support and structure to deal with challenges they may have to overcome in order to provide the necessary assurances to all parties involved. Secondly, by officially launching the Gibraltar Supported Internship Programme, this would allow employers to boast their accredited status as an inclusive employer, sharing with the community and their business clientele their participation in a worthy internship programme, as well as inspiring other employers to sign up too. Finally, the benefits for the intern are fantastic. The boost in confidence, social inclusion and motivation will manifest in happier, contributing individuals with relevant associated health benefits in certain cases too. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. The European Union for Supported Employment already have underpinning values and principles to assist us as policymakers in how to develop our own policy. But nothing can happen if we do not invest in this project. Establish a dedicated team of professionals and a clear criteria for the team to work on. There is an important demographic in our community who must be listened to. Their issues may not be headline-grabbing or fashionable, which is why we have a greater duty to bring their needs to the fore. We must focus on the real issues affecting people on a day-to-day and less on playing to the apparent masses. The electoral calculation of vote catching must be parked permanently. We have many seminars in lavish locations, but no one is tackling a proper system to support the most vulnerable in our community. Why is the government clearly pussyfooting on this issue? In the words of Elvis Presley himself, Mr. Speaker, a little less conversation, a little more action, please. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to e-government. The idea of having a fully fledged digital public service is one that really excites me. It is regrettable that we have lost the thrust, in particular on technological advances of the last 10 years, and the increase in persons having access to the internet too. More lamentable is the delay in not delivering e-services as initially roadmapped by the ITLD department in 2015. By 2015, particularly with Brexit in mind, we should be increasing efficiency and strengthening our public service digital bloc. I look forward to the coming measures that the Minister for E-Services has announced during the summer. The government has spent more than 2.1 million on e-services. I would be grateful for clarification as to whether this expenditure figure has now been exceeded and what the total contracted services for the provision of e-services are expected to be. The government claim they have procured this through proper and fair processes. However, the principal auditor has highlighted in a value for money audit the disaster that was a contract between the government and Maverick, costing the taxpayer 1.83 million. Not related to e-services, but is related to rebranding and internet services. Also, Mr. Speaker, it was highlighted an expenditure to the tune of £662,000 with Elitard Internet Limited and Elitech UK Limited. In his report, the principal auditor highlights, among other concerns, A, poor procurement as it bypassed national procurement tender regulations, B, a lack of consultation with government's IT and LD department, and C, potentially even breaching EU procurement thresholds. It appears the government has not learned from their mistakes. That is, not to consult closely with the ITLD, given their recent demonstration outside this House. Clearly, They have been completely sidelined by this ministry, and I strongly believe it is vital to consult and build on the expertise from within. Mr. Speaker, I must also align myself with the concerns of the Principal Auditor regarding entertainment expenses claimed by LPS, together with motor vehicle expenses and petrol. As concerning as this may be, it is symptomatic of the urgent need to bring actual government-owned companies into the scrutiny of the Gibraltar Audit Office. It is a touch unfair to highlight these expenses as a drain on the public purse whilst not being able to tackle wholly owned government companies which are financed by the taxpayer. And whilst on the subject of the good work by the Principal Auditor and his team, when is the government going to introduce legislation for the Gibraltar Audit Office to provide us with a more efficient, and I quote, a more efficient and audit office fully independent of government during the first year in office as they committed to do in the 2011 election? Where is the bill, Mr. Speaker? Seems like banning the importation of ivory is higher up on the government's agenda. The need for new legislation is evidenced by the fact that the Principal Auditor sent his report in January this year to this House, but we have only received it barely 2 weeks ago. Last year, during my budget address, I spoke about the allegations of bankruptcy thrown from the opposition benches year on year to the government of the day. I stand by what I said, in that I sincerely trust that no Gibraltarian would ever want to intentionally jeopardise the economic future of our nation, more so those who stand for election and have earned the trust and respect of the elected. Therefore, I was happy to hear the Chief Minister say in this House late last year, and I quote, "The allegation of purported or near bankruptcy has been one thrown from the opposition benches, whoever might have been the incumbent, to those on this side of the House, whoever might have been the incumbent, without even the shame of waiting for a year for when people have changed chairs." However, the lack of transparency and information regarding how we are expected to repay projects, for example, our schools, is regrettable. For example, Mr. Speaker, in 15-16, it was forecasted that 4.8 million would be spent on the refurbishment of St. Bernard's School project at the old St. Bernard's Hospital. It is reported by the Principal Auditor that this expenditure was transferred from the INDF to a government-owned company at the request of the Financial Secretary. Similarly, the government received a payment of 13.9 million from the government-owned company in respect of works previously paid for by the INDF. These are clear transactions to the benefit of government, which accumulate almost £19 million. The government can argue that school refurbishments are linked to sale of property, either decommissioned former school buildings or new parking spaces. But this should not excuse the government for not incorporating the revenue and expenditure of these projects through the estimates book. And on the topic of schools, I must make reference to the unprioritised De Rio St. Martin School, promised to parents by May 2017 and only just seen works commence recently. I am sure it will look great, but the fact that it has not been prioritised despite the flurry of projects the government has embarked on and completed is regrettable. Additionally, I would be grateful if the government could provide details regarding the Crown land sold for £50 million in 15-16, given this created a substantial amount of revenue for the government, and we have asked the government before in this House. This amount is highlighted by the Principal Auditor, and I think it is only just right that we receive clarification as to what that transaction is. Mr. Speaker, I, as well as my colleagues on this side of the House, have demonstrated Gibraltar is not as rosy as the government would have you believe. Should you go into the online presentation of the budget, you will simply find the cost of capital projects, but no details as to how they will be funded, or more importantly, how they will be repaid by this community. The debate on our public finances should be one based on honesty. As projects go up, we should know how they're being paid and how they are going to be financed in the future. Serviced in the future, rather. There has to be a recalibration in the way politicians deliver projects. If you spend £95 million on a new energy plant, levy the relevant revenue source to cover that expenditure. Let's not pretend that electricity prices don't have to go up, and the government should continue to subsidise consumption to the extent that it does. It is not, if not just from an environmental angle, but from a fiscal angle too, be clear with people of what is expected from them in return. That is the GST way of doing things. There was no fear as to whether our public spending was too high. We had every faith in the hands of Sir Peter Caruana. If you're going to boast about ideas, and obtaining value for money, don't spend £40 million on cladding for a facelift on buildings built more than 50 years ago, when you know that you can build better quality homes for a fraction of the price. Let's have a long-term vision in how we do things and develop our land for the next generations. I have tried to be as balanced as possible in delivering my address, praising the government where credit is due and holding them to account, highlighting flaws and areas where, quite frankly, more needs to be done and where things could have been done better. But one thing is certain, Mr. Speaker, despite our political differences, despite the diatribe at times in this House, I know that we have more that unites us than divides us. Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank you, the clerk and his team, for the hard work they do and wish you all the very best in preparing for the next general election. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.